Good morning, Good morning, not quite, good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to be here, and I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land. What I've got here today is the presentation I made at the launch of this year's Scanlon Foundation report, hence the date November. It was launched on the 30th of November of last year. But before I start, I thought I might make something which is perhaps a bit more germane and relevant, if one can say that, to this community. Because I've had the pleasure over the last 2 years to undertake a study in Bendigo. And Bendigo was a town not that far from here where social cohesion was fractured, I would say. Not everyone would say, but I would say. I would say that multiculturalism, it was not one of its brightest moments. And if we try to sort of unpack what happened in Bendigo, and those of you who don't know, the issue all rose over the planning application for a mosque. And then that led to protests and more protests, and then some quite serious demonstrations. Like at one stage, more than 400 police had to be bussed into that region to deal with demonstrations and so on, and to understand why that happened. And my understanding is it didn't need to happen. It didn't need to happen. And that's why this is sort of relevant here to this presentation, because at the core of it, the issue is, well, what is the balance of public opinion, particularly in large regional centres? Yeah. Is it that the people who are opposed to cultural diversity are just a very small minority who could make a lot of noise? Or are we dealing with actually serious unease within the largest segment of the established older residents of those towns? That might be Wodonga, it might be Albury, but it was Bendigo. And it's pretty hard to get like evidence for that. Like one of the things I did was I interviewed 40 people from the mainstream of the community. And this was a project funded by the Victorian government. But I also wanted to look at any sort of hard data that might be available. Now, one piece of hard data is election results, because there were in Bendigo people who stood for election, representing Rise Up Australia and the Country Alliance and various groups like that. And they struggled to get 5% of the vote. So if we use that as a piece of evidence, we say, well, they really are a very small minority, they really can't go anywhere. And someone like Pauline Hanson can get a constituency and support in Queensland, to lesser extent in Western Australia, and much lesser extent in Victoria. So there's further evidence that certainly in a place like Victoria, even regional centres, we're talking of a small minority. But there's another piece of evidence, and that's the Bendigo Council elections in 2016. And you need to look at it quite closely. And when you look at it quite closely, what you find is that the anti-mosque candidates in the council election actually did very nicely. The two most prominent got more than 2,500 votes. And that was typically enough to get yourself elected. And one of them didn't get elected and the other one did. It depended on preference flows. So that, in a way, is a sort of a wake-up issue. And then some of the learnings of what happened in Bendigo was, again, this is just my take on it, a failure of the council to meaningfully consult. What happened there was that there was concern that any form of consultation became a shouting match, that there couldn't be civil conversations. And if there couldn't be civil conversations, they weren't going to have any conversations at all. And that further heightened concerns and negativity. And when leading elements of the business community came out and said, we support mosque and we support diversity. They may have done it in such a way that they didn't speak to the mainstream. You may know, for example, that the Bendigo Bank closed the account of the anti-mosque group. And they said, well, because what they stand for is not consistent with the values of the Bendigo Bank, which is about inclusivity and community building. So they certainly had justification for what they did. But was it the best thing to do? So for me, there's a central message. The central message is that there's actually quite a lot of unease, that in the day of social media, it is much easier to mobilise that unease. It's much easier to spread false stories within the community. And we joke about false facts and so on, a la Donald Trump, etc. But there's actually like reality there. You know, one recent example was Anne Ali, Dr. Anne Ali, a Muslim member of federal parliament, and some people put out a message that she refused to lay a wreath on Anzac Day or something like that. Well, before you can do anything about that, lots of people believe that, and it's very hard to then rebut that. Some of the stories in Bendigo were that this was going to be the biggest mosque in the Southern Hemisphere, that all the land around the mosque had been purchased, that there was going to be a settlement of 20,000 Muslims coming to Bendigo. How are we doing? And people believe that. You know, the airport was going to be extended so they could actually fly large jets into the airport. You know, A380s coming with Muslims. One of the people I interviewed said, listen, how could you possibly believe that? Like, what are these 20,000 Muslims going to do in Bendigo? You know, so like authentic Australian cynicism says that's a lot of bullshit. But these were the stories that were circulating in Bendigo, having an impact in Bendigo. And when did the council get in the business of seriously rebutting those? 18 months down the track, after the first big demonstration, which caused mayhem and won international media coverage. That's when they thought we should be actually out there trying to rebut these stories. September 2015. It started in January 2014. So I think there's a real challenge not to talk to one segment of the community, but to talk across the community and particularly engage the mainstream. Yeah? Because, you know, if you have these festivals celebrating multiculturalism, so are you engaging the broad community? Yeah? Or are you talking to the 20 or 30 or whatever percentage of the population who is signed up and passionate? Because the challenge is really to talk to the middle ground and to win the middle ground over, and it can be done. Because what the survey data to me says is that the middle ground, while they may be uneasy about issues, are listening, wanting to be listened to, wanting to be engaged, wanting to go along on that journey. But they have to be listened to, they have to be accommodated. Yep. So if people are here from positions within service organisations, within council, etc., understand that there's this huge challenge and a responsibility to effectively engage the community. And I think the story of what happened in Bendigo, and still is there to the present day, is that that community, the middle ground, was not effectively engaged. The messaging was wrong. When the Premier of Victoria came to Bendigo and said most of the protesters can't spell Bendigo, whatever the context, I would say wrong message. because you've got to win people over, not alienate them. So I'm quickly going to take you through these issues. I want to talk about the Scanlon Foundation surveys, some of the contextual issues, people's perception of problems facing Australia, the index of social cohesion, immigration, cultural diversity, and so on. There's quite a whole range of issues. So the importance of the Scanlon Foundation surveys, and 10 of them have been conducted now, and it's quite unusual to find that a philanthropic organisation, a foundation, actually funds significant surveying. Like we get that in America in a big way. Like some of you may know of the Pew Research Organisation, a number of other organisations. A lot of the billionaires in America fund particular causes, but believe it or not, they're actually people who fund genuine research. And the Pew Research Organisation is one that's been very generously funded by American billionaires. But in Australia, what we have is the Scanlon Foundation. And people will make all sorts of claims about public opinion, such as Dick Smith. You heard of Dick Smith? Like, I'm really surprised at Dick Smith. I think he's a rational person, isn't he? Like, he does aeroplanes and airports and things like that. He flies a helicopter. He lands helicopters. And yet he comes out with, 99% of people, to this survey said, we want to cut back on immigration. A majority of us, and this is like the Herald Sun, like one of the things that journalists can do is, from the bottom drawer, bring out another story bashing immigrants or bashing particular immigrant groups. Sudanese gangs are very popular at the moment. But what about the truth behind this? Now, so these are the Scanlon Foundation surveys, and if you don't know surveying, this doesn't mean very much to you. There's sample sizes and so on, but the point is that until the Scanlon Foundation surveys, there was no systematic surveying of Australian opinion on immigration and cultural diversity. We're really in marked contrast with Canada. There's two big Western countries of immigration, Australia and Canada. The Canadian government, for decades, has been funding several surveys every year to track public opinion. They're called their tracking surveys on immigration and cultural diversity. And the reason they do this is they've got like billions of dollars invested in immigration programs, so you've got to get it right. And in Australia, hard to believe, but we didn't, until the Scanlon Foundation, have systematic surveying. And the Scanlon Foundation pushes the boundaries. It doesn't just want simple answers at lowest cost, it wants the best possible answers. So in 2017, we didn't just do one survey. We did the national survey, a Queensland Boost, which is actually funded by the Queensland Government Authority. Then we did we did two different panel surveys. What are panel surveys? So the issue with any scientific surveying, unlike Dick Smith with his 99%, which is what the cat brought in, but how do you do significant scientific surveys? You have to have a random sample of the population. What does a random sample of the population mean? It means everybody in the population has got an equal chance of being asked to complete the survey. How do you get the random sample? From the telephone book. And now that people are so reliant on mobiles, you know that this is the range of mobiles, so you randomly sample the mobiles. The problem with that is that if someone's talking to you on the telephone, as opposed to you completing the survey without anyone talking to you, you can get different answers. Yeah? So that's why this time around the Scanlon Foundation did panel surveys as well as the telephone surveys. Because the panel surveys are completed online by people without the intercession of an interviewer. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And we did a probability and a non-probability survey. A probability survey is a random survey using a panel. And the way that that was done is the Social Research Centre has set up a probability panel, meaning instead of people putting their hands up and saying, I'll join your panel, they went out and recruited people who were representative of the population. Is that making sense? Most of the surveys that you will see nowadays use non-probability panels because they're much cheaper. You go on the internet and you say, who'd like to join our panel? And every survey you do, you get points. So you get about $3 worth of points or $5 or whatever. And you also get to say what you think. But the problem with that is it may not be representative of the population because people who join the panel may have strong opinions and that's why they join the panel. So there's problems with that. Anyway, I can talk about this later. I don't need to go on because you're more interested in the nuts and bolts rather than how we actually do the surveys. But the point I'm trying to make is the foundation funds all different methodologies to make sure that we get good answers. And you know what we found? On a really important issue such as attitude to Muslims, you get different answers if you're talking to an interviewer on the telephone as opposed to you doing the survey yourself in the privacy of your study. So I'll tell you about that in a minute. The demographic context, as you understand, is that we've got a rapidly growing population. You know, if you looked at the long term, Australia's population growth annually is about 1.4% per annum. In some recent years, we've got up to 2.2%. And the average would be 1.6, 1.7. So in the recent times, we've had faster than average population growth. And that's no surprise to you, yes? And Victoria's been leading the charge. Victoria's been growing at such a rate that one day we'll overtake Sydney in terms of population. The overseas born has gone from 25 to 28. That's not so significant, but what's so significant is that in absolute numbers, some of the groups that were not traditionally resident in Australia have grown quite rapidly. For example, those of the non-Christian faith have doubled between 2006 and 2016. And we've got all different visa categories. I won't go into that. This shows the ups and downs of population growth each year. You know, we had that peak just before the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008. Slump went down. But the long-term pattern has been quite high immigration intake. And the categories in which people are coming, only a small number are coming on the humanitarian program or as refugees. The largest number are coming as skilled, and then there's a smaller number coming at family reunion. But the largest intake is a skilled intake. And one of the things that the census shows us is that we've got larger concentrations of immigrant populations than we had, and it's increasing. So just to interpret that, in Melbourne in 2006, 3% of Melbourne's population lived in local government areas where at least 50% were overseas born. Is that making sense? And by 2016, it was 11%. And Sydney has greater concentrations. The Sydney immigrant population is more concentrated in the western suburbs. In Melbourne, there are a number of nodes, southeast and northern Melbourne and western Melbourne. But what we're seeing is greater diversity and greater concentration of immigrant populations. And to really get a sense of what's going on, you've got to look at faith groups in local government areas, and the first bit is Greater Dandenong. These are the three main non-Christian faith groups, or Canterbury Bankstown in Sydney. See, in Canterbury Bankstown in 2001, you had about 55,000 of the main non-Christian faith groups. By 2016, it was 100,000. All right? So these are significant population increases. Australia as a country is dealing with, I would say, fairly rapid change. Fairly rapid change. Like if you're as old as me, you can recall days when, when my family came to Australia in the second half of the 1950s, and I came as a refugee from Hungary. In my lifetime, this was still very much a country of the White Australia policy, which was starting to come to grips with diverse European peoples. The White Australia policy, which was an exclusive racial policy which said that non-Europeans couldn't settle permanently in Australia, that really came to an end around 1980. Like people say 1972, 73, but it took a while for that to work through the system. So for Australia to get to a non-discriminatory policy, we're talking early 1980s. That's not so long ago, is it? And then you look at the rapidity of change, and in a way, doesn't it say, this is a remarkable country? It's a remarkable country that's coped with such rapid change. Like what flashpoints have we had? And you'd say, well, Bendigo. But at the end of the day, what happened in Bendigo? Compared to some of the things that are going on in Europe and the Middle East, and Cronulla, that again, by the standard of major problems overseas, they're relatively minor and relatively rare, and they shouldn't have happened anyway. Certainly not in Melbourne, not in Victoria, which is the home with South Australia of Australian multiculturalism. Shouldn't happen. So this is like another way to capture extent of diversity. Because if you just look at overseas born, you don't really capture the diversity, because it doesn't capture the children of the immigrants. You with me on that? So you see, what percentage of those have both parents born in Australia? In these, less than 10%. So those with both parents born in Australia are a rarity. I don't think that's the case in Albury-Wodonga. It's certainly not the case in Bendigo. But there's still diversity here. But speak a language other than English in the home, 75 or 86%. And more than 1 in 5 of people in some areas don't speak English well. So project that 10 years forward at the current rate of change, and you're getting a sense of the potential pressures that Australia's under, and how we actually have to be smart and continue to be smart to deal with these issues. So we've got a question in the survey, and it's the first question we ask. And the reason we ask it first is people don't know what the survey is about. Another danger with surveys is you cue people. You know, someone asks, will you do the survey? And you think, well, all right, what do you want me to say? What's this survey about? So it's not as we slap people over the face and say, okay, forget everything you know and just give me straight answers to this. People want to sort of answer in a particular way once they know what the survey is about. Like, for example, what's your favourite television program? And it's actually some sort of tabloid program, but you don't want to say that. Yeah? Yeah, I watch ABC. Four Corner. So you don't necessarily get an authentic answer because people are sort of trying to work out, okay, what's in it for me? So this is an open-ended question. It's the first in the survey. You get low percentages for each because you can say anything. And what's interesting is that always economy is the number one issue, but it's been sort of tending down. Quality of government is sort of coming out as number 2 issue in this country. Immigration has been going up in significance, but see the small numbers, and I'll come back to this. When people got worried about terrorism in Australia, it went from less than 1 to 10% in 1 year, and it's still quite high. But this sort of gives us a sense of mood, and I'll come back to it. You know, because if people say, I'm against immigration, you also need to know, okay, nice, and how strongly do you feel about that issue? And you can see here it's going up, but it's about 6% of the people say, yeah, that's my issue. All right, the broad trend of the Scanlon Monash Index, and we've got a number of areas that we look at to try to work out how cohesive are we as a society. And the answer is less than we were 10 years ago. You know, our index was 100, we're down at 88.5, which is close to the lowest we've got, but it's the average of the last 5 years. The big change in Australia occurred between 2009 and probably 2010, 2011, period of the global financial crisis and a collapse of trust in government. Mr. Rudd left a legacy, and it's not a good legacy. He promised a lot and he delivered little. And since that time, there's been quite low level of trust in Australia in politicians. It was probably never fantastic, but it's low. Again, I'll come back to it. The main decline in our index has been in the area of acceptance or rejection. More people saying that actually they're a bit worried about immigration issues, or more people feeling discriminated against. So that's something to look at. You know, the message is we've done well, we could have done better, and we need to do better. So if we compare 2007 and 2017, people on social justice issues, people on low income receive enough support from the government, down from 46 to 39. Australia is a land of economic opportunity where if you work hard, you can get on. It's still very high, but it's gone from 81 to 75. So you don't want to see these figures going along these lines over the next 10 years, do we? Like, we don't want to see that number go down to 69 and so on. So these are sort of challenges. Experience of discrimination, and this is really, I think, an issue of concern. Because we ask people doing the survey, have you experienced discrimination on the basis of your skin colour, ethnicity or religion over the last 12 months? And there's a pattern there. Do you see the pattern and you see the consistency? When we were first doing the surveys, we were getting 9, 10, then 14% or thereabouts. Then it jumped up to 19%. And then in the last 5 years, we've got 19, 18, 20, 22, 2020. And it's not just so much the numbers, but that's double the level of people reporting discrimination, feeling discriminated against, than when we started. So what that could mean is that there's a segment of the population that has been emboldened to discriminate, to act out their prejudice. That's one possible interpretation of those numbers. When people are thinking about the future, increasing pessimism. So right across these surveys, and you can see the consistency in the numbers, the trend is downward. It's not downward by a huge number, but it's not a positive picture. What about immigration? Now, we've got people out there who are convinced that the majority of the Australian population does not want immigration anymore. We're full. And you've got any number of newspaper columnists explaining that we're full. Australians are sick of immigration. It's doing nothing for the country. It's fine if you live in Albury-Wodonga, but if you live in Melbourne, try and get on a train. You know, try and drive down the road and see if you can get from A to B in less than an hour. These sorts of issues. But the actual numbers that we get in the surveys are that it's a substantial number, but it's not a majority. And in surveying, you need to understand how do people answer that type of question. Because the value of the Scanlon surveys is they give us perspective. Yep. If you just have one survey in a single point in time, you don't really have much. Because you don't know, well, is that up or down? People said 55. Well, is that up or down? Is that good or bad? What do you measure it against? And it's naive to measure it against 50. You want to measure what's been changing over time. So there hasn't been a lot of change. So what's interesting here, if you just look at the darker purple colour, this sort of question, is immigration too high? It went as high as 70%, 72, 73, 74% of people thinking that immigration was too high in the recession of the early 90s. Do you remember Paul Keating? You know, the recession we had to have and so on. Well, he didn't have the recession because he was actually earning a nice salary, but the people who were not earning nice salaries, it wasn't so much fun. People who were worried about their employment and so on. Now, what's interesting is that that indicator of negativity towards immigration can go above 70, but in recent years, it's been relatively low, around 40% of people saying that they're worried about immigration. And you can see what the big predictor of attitudes to immigration is. You're decoding that, it's the level of unemployment. Because when you track the level of unemployment, attitudes to immigration, and at the end of the day, our level of unemployment is not really bad. Does anyone know what current unemployment levels are in Australia? It's about mid-fives, yeah? 5.4, 5.5, 5.6, that sort of number. And what's a very low number? 4. 4 is it's not 0. Yeah? You never get 0. You know, even in the 1950s, when we had full unemployment, that measure of unemployment was around 2%. Because if you measure like who's out of job, out of work on a particular date, well, some people are transitional, some people don't want to work, etc. So we're not really doing badly. We haven't jumped to like 10% unemployment, which is what we had in the early 90s. And the other thing is, like, you know why I hate doing these surveys? Because I'm obsessed with trying to get the right answer. The people who know what the answer is before they do the survey, they have an easy time. They just look for the numbers and they've got it. So one of the things we do is, I look at other surveys, other reliable surveys. And you can see here similar numbers. Now, there are people who've got high numbers. 70% of people don't want immigration. How do you get that? First of all, use a non-probability panel rather than a scientific survey. And secondly, you ask questions which lead people in certain directions, I would say. Yeah? Like, do you think Australia's full? Yeah. All right, 75% of people think Australia's full. Was that a neutral question? You need questions that are sort of not going to lead people. Another question that some people have asked recently, last year Australia had 250,000 people arrive. Do you think that was too much? Do you understand the problem with that? Like, do you and you have a similar understanding what 250,000 mean? Yeah? It's like you end up overseas in Hong Kong and you don't know what the currency is actually. This costs 200, what does that mean? You know, so there's real art to questions construction, and we try and construct questions that will give us reliable answers. So what am I saying about immigration? It hasn't really shifted that much in terms of increasing negativity, and it's a bit surprising, given that if you picked up the Herald Sun or the Australian, you wouldn't certainly get that understanding. That's the first thing. And I guess you could make a second point. If 40% of people think immigration is too high, well, that's actually quite a decent number. Yeah? It's not like 10%. So immigration at the best of times is difficult to sell. Because how many of you here benefit from immigration? 1, 2, 3, yeah? I'd say less than 10% of the people in the audience, yeah? Is immigration going to put bread on your table? Well, if you've got a store downtown and you're selling stuff to immigrants, if you're actually building a housing estate and you want people to come, yes. But for most people, it's not that brilliant. All right, so it hasn't really become more negative, but it's a sizable number. Do people want to go back to the days of discrimination when you could select immigrants on the basis not of their skills, on their attributes, their age, what they bring to the country, because of their race or because of their religion? And only a small minority would like to see us go back to that. 16%, 20%. Again, it's not zero, but it's not like 60%. What about strength of opinion? This is going back to the first question that I asked. For whom is it the number one issue? 6% of the people say it's the main issue, compared to 26% who say it's the economy. And also the way that things can rapidly increase when people get concerned. You see there that concern about national security and terrorism went from 0.4 to 9.9, or 0.7 to 9.9 in 1 year. So that again gives us a measure that it's not such a huge problem for most people. Cultural diversity. When we first asked this question in 2013, I was surprised, because we asked people, do you agree that multiculturalism has been good for Australia? And if you add strongly agree and agree, you get 85% who think multiculturalism has been good for Australia. It's very unusual in survey to get that bigger number for any question. When you've got 5 response options, you get 85% people saying yes. So I've done other surveys in regional Queensland. I actually selected an area that was renowned because they'd returned a One Nation Member of Parliament more than any other seat in Queensland. This was, can you keep a secret? The Atherton Tableland, inland from Cairns. And on the Atherton Tableland, when we asked that question, 70% of the people agreed that multiculturalism has been good for Australia. Wow. And then I looked at it and said, how could that be? And then you realise a fundamental reality about Australia. We are an immigrant nation. Yeah? Anyone suggests who were immigrants who left their mark on the Atherton Tableland? Italians. What on earth were Italians doing on the Atherton Tablelands? Growing what? Crops. Growing crops, and some of them were in the sugar industry, came as cane cutters and so on. And people in the 1920s were convinced that they were the scum of the earth, and why did we want Italians coming to Australia? That was such an amazing thing. Because what they wanted was people to settle on the land. Yeah? So what did they do? They recruited people from England to settle on the land. How did you reckon they went? They weren't farmers. They didn't want to realise that the Italians, who struggled in an adverse environment, most of them, growing crops in hot climates and so on. The best people you could possibly get. So these are the people on the Atherton Tableland. You're asking, has multiculturalism been good for Australia? And it's not bad. 70%. You know, some people think we should abandon the term multiculturalism, and I say, hello? If you've got a brand that works, why would you want to abandon it? This works. Look, 5 surveys, and basically each time we've got the same number. The main thing that's changed is that the proportion strongly agreeing has gone up. So if you want to be able to market something, you can do it. Multiculturalism is a strong brand, but you have to couch it in the right way. But sort of what does multiculturalism mean? Because it could mean many different things. You see, in Australia, it doesn't mean pluralism. Pluralism is you do your thing, and you guys and ladies do your thing. That's not what multiculturalism means. Certainly doesn't mean you can do your own thing and the government will give you money to do it. Yeah? For Australians, multiculturalism works when it's a two-way process. Yeah? It's a process where the established community adapts to the immigrants and the immigrants adapt to Australia. It's that two-way process. So about, nearly 2/3 of the people will agree both with that we should do more to learn about the customs of the immigrants and the people who come to Australia should adapt. So in terms of, say that I was hired to advise the Muslim community in Australia on their public relations, what would I tell them? What should you work on? You've got to work on the messaging, if you want to, that you're integrating into Australia, and do it in the most effective way possible. Yeah? So in a way, draping yourself around with the Australian flag, wearing a hijab, it's not bad. It's not bad at all, but you could maybe even do better. But that's what multiculturalism means for Australia. We accept that we are a country of immigrants. And you may think, well, so what? So what? Most of the Europeans don't. You think the French and the Germans accept that they are countries of immigrants? You think the British accept that they are a country of immigration? In these countries, when you ask, what do you think about immigration, you get 70 or 80% negative. In Australia, it's 40%. There are 2 countries in the world where you get clear majorities in favour of immigration, Australia and Canada, maybe New Zealand and a few others. But it's actually atypical. It's atypical for people to accept that they are an immigrant nation. Whereas we are, except for Indigenous Australians. Now this is interesting. The high level of negativity towards Muslims. And you see, what I've got there is in brackets, the number that you get when you ask the same question with an interviewer or self-administered. And the self-administered is a probability sample as well, so it's a reliable sample. But you see that hardly any difference for Christians and Buddhists. In fact, you get more people negative towards Christians if they're completing the survey themselves. Christians have had a rough press lately. And I guess it's not really a joke. But when I was doing the interviews in Bendigo, and with one segment of the community, I'd ask them, well, what do you think about Muslims coming into Bendigo? And some of the people would say, Muslims, listen, what I'm worried about is the brothers up on the hill. So that's part of the context. But the Muslims, much higher negativity when people are completing that survey in privacy. So, back to the future. No, only a minority supports policies of assimilation where it's up to the immigrants to integrate and we're not going to do anything. Only a minority supports return to a discriminatory immigration policy. But then only a minority supports government programs of cultural maintenance. And I believe that to interpret those numbers with regard to Muslims it's perceived lack of integration, value conflict, plus fear of terrorism. Fear of terrorism is a major issue. So let's now look at key findings, and can we believe these findings? Are they reliable? And we can look at 3 different issues here. Trend of opinion. Are they reliable in telling us about the trend of opinion? Are they reliable in telling us about variance across a population, like different segments of a population? And are they reliable in telling us what's the balance of the numbers? So let's look at these 3 issues. You know, people will make claims that we've got more negativity towards immigration, and the first question you ask them is, all right, well, so you got that number last week. When did you last do the survey? And the answer is, well, actually, we haven't done a survey before. So then how do you know the number's gone up? Don't let the media worry about those sort of complexities. It's a bit like, if I'm talking about surveys, like, is this complicated? Not complicated. A little bit complicated, not very complicated. It's not like I came here and I started talking to you about quantum physics. Yeah? I wouldn't, like, if I came here and explained to you how a quantum computer is supposed to work, that would be complicated. You know how Australia of the Year works in that field. That would be complicated, yeah? This is not so complicated. But the people, and I've had a lot of dealings with media over the last 10 years, yeah? It's as if, all right, don't tell me about quantum physics, just give me the numbers. You've got to ask critical questions. When did you last look at that survey? Have you only got one data point and you're telling me about trend? The only reliable indicator of trend are the Scanlon Foundation surveys in this field, which have done annual surveys. All right, variance across the population. Again, we've got a large measure of predictability here. The key predictors are age, education, and financial status. You're going to be likely, but not necessarily, but if you're elderly, didn't have much opportunity to have formal education, you're struggling financially, you're living on the pension, etc., you're more likely than less likely to be negative about cultural diversity and immigration. Because if you're young, university educated, career bound, you're more likely to be embracing the Greens. Because the key predictor is political alignment. So these variables are summed up in your decision. I support this party, that party. Yep. So let's look at immigration is too high. If we looked at One Nation supporters, 86% of One Nation supporters think that immigration is too high. Knock your socks off on that one. That's pretty consistent, isn't it? And also, if you've had education to year 11, you're struggling financially, you're aged over 75 or 65, as opposed to that Greens, where 14% of Greens supporters think immigration is too high. Really interesting, isn't it, that for Greens supporters, immigration, cosmopolitanism, open doors trumps the environment. Because Greens could say, all right, we don't want any more immigration, it's putting too much pressure on our natural resources, on our environment. We don't have much water, etc., etc. But in fact, for Green supporters, embracing diversity, multiculturalism, open doors trumps those sort of environmental concerns. Multiculturalism has been good for Australia. And disagree, even amongst One Nation, you're struggling to get 50% disagreeing with that statement. It's such a strong brand. Because remember, you know, on immigration, One Nation came out as 86 negative, but on this one it's 49. What about Greens? 2% of Greens voters think that multiculturalism has not been good for Australia. All right? Basically, you get kicked out of the party if you want to sort of put your head up and say, well, actually. So again, the same patterns. And if you then analyse attitudes to Muslims by age, you can see, that's the blue line there, how with age increasing negativity. All right, the balance, and this is the really important issue, it's what I started with. What's the lie of the land with regard to attitudes? What proportion though, in this camp, that camp, and in the middle? Now this is adding up a number of questions, interviewer administered, self-administered, and it's pretty much similar. See, the strong negative, 12 to 13%. The strong positive, 15 to 20%, so a bit larger, but they're the outliers. Then you've got this large group in the middle, and this is why I say you have to talk to the middle. Yeah? You have to ask yourself, like say if you're running an organisation such as you're running, yes, with regard to embracing multiculturalism, immigration, humanitarian issues, refugees, the great danger is that you talk to your own people, that you're talking to that 15, 21%, 30%. And the danger is that if you're not talking to the middle, you actually can further alienate the middle. Because they know that you're having a party, but you don't fit in. You weren't invited, you weren't included. So if you were on shaky grounds and uncertain, is that going to pull you in this direction, or does it leave you susceptible to being pulled in that direction? So always the challenge is to talk to the middle. What could the Bendigo Council do whenever they tried to have a meeting, people would storm the meeting and shout people down? You know, you couldn't have a civil discourse. What could you do? And the answer was, well, not much. Let's pack up and they'll go away. They didn't go away. They're still there. And that's the great risk, because if you build a building, you understand the risk, you're a sitting target. Because what, particularly, not the 12 to 13%, but the 1%, you know, whose passion in life is to, whose meaning in life is to save Australia by shutting out the infidel. Yeah? They've got a target there, and the community, the middle ground, may be watching, but they're not saying, go away, we don't want you. And that's what the middle ground has to say. The middle ground has to say, not in our town. Who said not in our town? Who got that message across? But this is just such an important issue. That the challenge is not to stage a party, great as it is, and I don't want to demean that, but it's to how to effectively communicate. So what I would have done, and that's with hindsight, start to have some quiet, small group meetings. Doesn't that make sense? You invite a dozen people, a couple of people from Rotary, from the local church, which you know is very conservative, and a couple from here, and you start to tease things out and you discuss things. And you don't necessarily make yourself a target. Yeah? How did the council make itself a target? Because they said, well, we support multiculturalism and diversity. Good. But how could they not have made themselves a target? By saying, listen, we're about planning laws. These are the planning laws. Further, in Australia we have a constitution. The constitution says you shall have freedom of religion. You cannot be taken away from you. And then what do? You cloak the constitution in the Australian flag. Our sons and our fathers fought for the constitution. Yeah? Does that make sense? Why make yourself a target? We're actually upholding the constitution. You cut the ground from the Australian patriots. You are the patriots. You're upholding the constitution. If you've got a problem, take it to Canberra. We are simply upholding the constitution. And you say that and you say that and you say that. So I believe that there's ways of handling issues by not inflaming issues, by not creating targets, by talking to the middle. And you see, this is, in a way, shows the reliability of surveys, because we did the same survey with very different methodologies. Telephone interviewer, and the Life in Australia is a probability panel where people complete the survey anonymously on their computers. And you see the numbers are always almost the same, except for cultural maintenance attitudes to Muslims, where people clearly will understate how they feel. So what happens with multiculturalism is that people are essentially positive, but amongst the positive, you break that down to the strong positive, you've got about 40% who are a bit sort of not as strong in their support for multiculturalism. Does that make sense? Because you get positive by adding strongly agree and agree. If you just do strongly agree, then you can actually find that amongst those, there's people who've got some qualifications, all right? But when you look at attitude to Muslims, what happens there is that the middle can be very easily drawn to the negative, right? Because when we just you divided on 3-point scale, negative, middle, positive 30, negative 25, middle 45. But if I just want to look at strong opinions, the opinions that aren't going to be swayed, doesn't matter what you do to me, yeah? Then you've got quite a large middle ground, and that can easily be drawn to the negative. So Australia in 2007 and 2017, one, we're rapidly changing as a country. We're becoming much more diverse. So it's not only the population is growing, but it's increasingly becoming more diverse. We have a situation of relatively high negative attitude to Muslims for a complex range of reasons. The trend of attitudes over time is negative. It's not huge, but it's 3, 4, 5, 6% more negative than we were in 2007. And a major problem, in addition, is lack of trust in political leadership. And there's a potential in this environment for extremes to grow. So let me just finish with this. This is, how often do you think the government in Canberra can be trusted to do the right thing for the Australian people? And trust fell off the cliff between 2009 and 2010. You see that? It went from 48% to about 30%, never recovered. My expectation was that when there was a change of government in 2013, trust would be recovered. This is the Abbott government. It wasn't recovered. Why? Because they came out straight away and broke a lot of promises and brought in a horror budget. You know? So that hardly enhanced trust in Canberra. Would you say the system of government we have works fine, needs minor change, major change, and so on? So you see, when now needs major change should be replaced, that's about 40% of people think that. And the people who think it's working really fine is 14%. So we've got real problems about governance. And if you compare Australia and Canada, what happened in Canada is under the premiership of Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, he's actually recovered a lot of the ground. We haven't had that. You see, how much trust do you have in the national government? So we've got, in this survey, 48%, in Canada, 67%. And there's this capacity to magnify negativity on immigration, cultural diversity. We've got real concerns. How important a problem facing Australia? See, One Nation are obsessed with population. Why? Why is population such a big issue? Because it's tied in with national identity. They're worried about national identity, and they see immigration as impacting on national identity, as undermining Australia. Accepting immigrants from many countries makes Australia stronger. And on this side, you've got disagreement. So One Nation, it's 82% disagreement. Liberal, National, 34. Labor, 28. Greens, almost nothing. So there's this segment of the population, and it's small, But 5, 10, 15% in a community like this, seriously concerned about the impact of immigration on the future of this country. So, pattern of change is just minor negative, but do we still have the resilience that we had in 2007? If we had another major economic shock like the global financial crisis, how well placed are we to deal with that? This is the sort of problem when the trend is downwards and in a way you've got less money in the bank to take out on a rainy day because you took it out already. Okay, thank you.